Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickerson from Dubbo Regional Council.
Matthew, what are your initial reactions to the New South Wales budget, particularly for the Canberra region and surrounds?
The focus from my perspective is typically about regional areas. What are we looking at for regional areas? How are we benefiting regional areas? And not so much specifically around the Canberra, Queanbeyan area, but when I look at overall what's happening from a regional New South Wales perspective, there's a few things there that are good and bad. One of the things that I'm intrigued about is a trust fund that's being put together, and I don't fully understand the details yet. Obviously the budget's only just come out, but a fund that allows regional areas to access about $350 million. Now at first glance, that sounds good. If there's any additional money, and I assume this is additional money for regional areas, that sounds like a really good thing. The slight concern I have around that is how that would operate. Who actually decides on that particular process, where that money might go? They talk about an advisory council. What's the makeup of that advisory council? Community groups can apply for some of that money directly. Does that mean that councils, for example, are being sidelined in that process? And I would argue that councils are a very effective community organisation with good governance in place to start with, but also as a community organisation, hopefully councils know what is needed by their community, by people in their community. So that's one that hopefully is a good outcome, but I want to see some more detail around that. Housing is obviously a big issue. Lots of people want to move to regional locations. That's very exciting. So we're seeing some money put aside there for housing. We're seeing some extra money for Landcom, for some affordable housing. So again, when we talk about housing, talk about getting extra money out for housing, they're all good things. The other thing that was in the budget was an announcement which we were already aware of, but $390 million for road funding. That was an election promise, and certainly we'd heard that discussion before, so that was to be expected, money to be expected to be rolled out as part of that. And again, money for roads is a very important part of it. The other one that I suppose was a little bit confusing, and I'm not sure the government totally gets what is needed in this particular scenario. They allocated $440 million to get 500 paramedics to rural and regional areas, and also healthcare workers to regional areas. They're increasing the incentive from $10,000 to $20,000 for someone from a metro area to move to a regional area in those specific jobs. And I don't know that that's the best way to increase those particular occupations in regional areas. A lot of people in metro areas would already be able to move and be happy to move to a regional area, but they don't always know about what's on offer. They don't know about the jobs that are on offer in regional locations. Giving someone a one-off incentive, whether that be $10,000 or $20,000, seems like the wrong message to send. For those people that are already in those regional areas, well, there's no thank you to those people for already being in those regional areas and staying there. It's almost better for them to move back to a metro area and then move back to a regional area. A one-off incentive isn't the smartest way to go, in my opinion. I think we'd be better off spending some of that money on educating people in metropolitan locations about what's on offer in various regional locations.
We spoke about earlier, Matthew, and obviously could certainly understand if you haven't had enough time to sift through this one, but as we were talking about before, the funding for the SAP project in the snowy Monero region has been slashed quite significantly. I guess perhaps in general terms, if you haven't sort of been able to obviously dig into the specifics, what does this mean for the snowy Monero region? And has this come as a disappointment to you, given that this really had the opportunity to potentially leverage business opportunities in that region?
One of the things that I look at when I look at different models around the world is that there are some places around the world that are very effective at moving industry inland, taking away the pressure from coastal areas, and in our case, Newcastle, Sydney, Wollongong. There's a lot of pressure there with a lot of businesses there, a lot of industry there, and then obviously the freight side of that. If you can move some of those industries inland, and if you can encourage some of those industries to move inland, that seems to be better for both inland populations in terms of that increase in population, but also can be better for industry as well. And the special activation precincts, or the SAPs as they've been known, have been, I think, working so far, but they are in their formative stages. And so they need some time to develop. They need continued investment from government, in my opinion, to continue to actually develop those. Any reduction in that funding now is short-sighted. You really want a long-term commitment to SAPs to make sure that you can build up that industry. When you have a SAP that starts, it's not going to develop overnight. You need that SAP to have time. You need industry to have time to move out. It takes time to build all that up. So it does seem a little bit short-sighted in my opinion, and that will have an impact on any of those areas that have been SAP so far, and that includes, as you talked about down in your area, it includes places like Parkes, Moree, even Wagga. Wagga's fairly large, so Wagga will probably be okay with some of that removal, but all of those SAPs I think had huge potential.
In terms of cost of living, we know, of course, Matthew, that this is still an ongoing issue that's placing a lot of households under a lot of pressure at the moment. Do you feel that there was enough in this budget to, obviously the state government can only do so much with the capacity that it has as a state government, but do you believe there was enough in this budget to try and ease pressure for families? And do you think that do you think that's actually really necessary?
We've heard a lot of talk already from the opposition about the removal of the funding for the regional seniors card and removing a lot of those incentives there, if you like, or not so much incentives, some of those benefits there for regional seniors. So that was confirmed in the budget. So again, anything that has a negative impact on regional people is disappointing from my perspective. So you had some of that regional seniors funding removed, but you've also got some of the areas where I think we've got huge potential, some of the education, some of the TAFE education, some of the funding for transport, and some of those applied to metro as well as regional areas. But if we want to be a smart state, then encouraging education, having reduction or fee-free education, I think is incredibly important. So again, at first glance, seeing some of the removal of some of that funding, some of the removal of some of those fee-free processes is disappointing. Cost of living pressures, it's tough. We know that inflation over the last 2 years has been 6.1% and then 6%. So that does make it hard for families, cost of living pressures there. Some of that will flow through if we can fix up some of our housing. A lot of those cost of living pressures are being driven by the dramatic increase in housing, both rentals and cost of housing in general. If we can get that right, and there's some money that was allocated for that, that might take some pressure off cost of living pressures. I mean, linked to that, and it's probably not directly linked, but I was certainly disappointed to see the removal of the stamp duty subsidy for people that were buying electric vehicles. Now we know in particular the ACT has been leading the way across the nation. The first 6 months of this year, over 20% of all new car sales in the ACT were electric vehicles. And a lot of that was based on some of the incentives that the ACT government had put in place, and they were coming to fruition. Across the rest of the nation, only 8.4% of new car sales in the first 6 months of this year were EVs, and it was starting to increase, and some of those increases were due to the federal government, the FBT exemption, but also the New South Wales government with the stamp duty removal for certain EVs, depending on the value, and the $3,000 subsidy. So now when that's just started, again, it seems a bit short-sighted to remove those when really they'd only just started. And some of that cost of living pressure could have been helped by people purchasing EVs or second-hand EVs that would come on the market, because we know that petrol is a major part of that cost of living pressure.
Lastly, Matthew, overall in your opinion and perspective, a win or a loss for regional Australia in this New South Wales budget?
It's a tough one. I'm going to sit on the fence on this one. I'm going to say some wins and some losses. I would love to see a budget that was all wins for regional New South Wales. So on that basis, I'd probably like to see a slightly different budget, but some wins and some losses for regional.
We'll leave it there, Matthew. Thanks very much for your time and for your insights at such short notice. It's much appreciated.
My pleasure.
Great, thank you.
Mayoral Memo with Matthew Dickinson from Dubbo Regional Council.